The moment I stepped onto the plane, I felt an odd sense of relief. Finally, a vacation. A well-earned break. Hawaii was supposed to be my reset button, my escape from work, schedules, and responsibility. I was just another passenger, an anonymous traveler heading toward paradise. At least, that's what I thought, until she sat down next to me. It started with a bang. Literally. The seat beside me slammed down hard enough to jostle my arm, followed by an overly perfumed presence shifting into place. I turned, already bracing myself for a half-hearted apology from some stranger in a hurry. But it wasn't a stranger. It was her. Susan. My ex-wife. The one woman I never thought I'd see again, and the one woman I certainly didn't want to. She didn't notice me at first. She was too busy fumbling with her oversized handbag, adjusting her designer sunglasses, and clicking her perfectly manicured nails against the seat's armrest. But the second she turned, her face lit up. Not with warmth, not with recognition, but with pure, unfiltered amusement. "Oh, my God." She let out a dramatic gasp, lowering her glasses. "Is that you, Dropout Dude?" I clenched my jaw. Dropout Dude. That's what she used to call me when we were younger, when things were good, before they weren't. She thought she was clever, reducing my entire existence to one phrase. It wasn't even accurate. I didn't drop out. I walked away. There's a difference. I nodded once. A curt, polite acknowledgement. Nothing more. But Susan? Susan wasn't one for subtlety. "Wow," she continued, dragging out the word like she had all the time in the world. "This is wild. I mean, what are the chances? It's been, what, years?" She grinned, but there was no kindness in it, just the same condescension I remembered too well. "I almost didn't recognize you. You look so well the same." I turned back toward the window, already exhausted. The view outside was far more appealing. Endless sky, a horizon untouched by the past. But Susan wasn't done. "So," she leaned in, lowering her voice as if she was about to uncover some great mystery. "What are you doing here? You're not seriously going to Hawaii, are you?" She let out a light, insincere laugh. "Did you win a contest or something?" I exhaled through my nose, willing myself to remain calm. "A vacation," I said simply. Susan's eyebrows shot up. "A vacation? You?" She tilted her head. "I thought you'd still be, working the odd jobs and all that." There it was. The jab. The little dig. She couldn't help herself. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I shrugged. "I work hard. I take vacations. That's usually how it goes." Susan blinked, as if the concept was foreign to her. And maybe it was. Last I checked, she was still riding the coattails of her new husband's wealth. "Oh, right," she said finally, drawing out the words. "I guess even people like you need a break. But Hawaii? That's a little ambitious, don't you think?" I turned my head just enough to look at her directly. "Is it?" She smirked. "I mean, it's not exactly budget-friendly. But then again, maybe you've finally realized that working smart is better than working hard." There it was again. That Susan way of speaking, pretending to be helpful while sneaking in as many insults as possible. I gave her a long, level stare. "I'm doing just fine." She laughed. Soft, amused, completely unbothered. Sure. If you say so." I turned away again, hoping she'd get the hint, but Susan had never been one to take a hint. "So anyway," she continued, crossing her legs as she got comfortable, "since we're stuck together for the next few hours, let's catch up." I sighed internally. She didn't wait for my approval. "You won't believe my life now," she started, flipping her hair over one shoulder. "I mean, I really leveled up, After we split, I realized I deserved more. And guess what? I got it." She paused, watching for a reaction. I didn't give her one. She pressed on. "I'm married now," she said, tilting her head like she was waiting for a gasp. "To a real man. A successful man." I glanced at her ring, a flashy, oversized diamond. "Predictable. Good for you," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Susan beamed. "Oh, it is good. He's incredibly successful. Owns multiple properties. We travel everywhere. Dubai, Paris, Santorini. You name it. She glanced down at my plain watch, the only accessory I wore. I'm guessing you haven't been out of the country much, huh? I resisted the urge to laugh. Instead, I just hummed. Susan didn't like that. She wanted more. A reaction. A crack. Something to prove she'd won. Well, she pressed, let's be honest. Some people were meant to struggle, and others were meant to succeed. That's just life, right? She smiled as if she just delivered some grand wisdom, and I let her have it. Because arguing with Susan was like arguing with turbulence. It wasn't worth the energy. Instead, I leaned back, watching the world outside. The sky stretched on forever, vast and unbothered. Susan could talk all she wanted. I wasn't interested. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Because just as I settled in, just as I tuned her out, the intercom crackled to life. And the announcement that followed would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew. A murmur ran through the passengers. A doctor? Someone must have been sick. Susan, being Susan, gasped theatrically. Oh my God, this is so dramatic. I ignored her. But then, a second announcement came. And this time, it wasn't for a doctor. If there is anyone on board who can fly this plane, please notify the crew immediately. Silence. Stillness. Then panic. Passengers stirred, whispering to one another. A few voices rose in concern. Susan froze. Wait, what? I didn't answer. Instead, I turned to see a flight attendant hurrying down the aisle, scanning the faces of passengers. And then, she stopped. Her eyes locked onto mine. Oh, thank God, she breathed. Jake, you're here. Susan's face went slack. She turned to me, her mouth opening and closing. And for the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. The cabin fell into stunned silence. The flight attendant's voice, though controlled, carried a sharp edge of urgency. If anyone on board can fly this plane, please notify the crew immediately. Whispers. Murmurs. Then a wave of panic as the realization sank in. What do you mean, fly this plane? Someone blurted out. Is this a joke? Another voice asked, trembling. A man in the row ahead of me stiffened, clutching his armrest. A woman nearby muttered prayers under her breath. Even the hum of the engines, steady and unwavering, seemed oddly ominous now. And Susan? Susan went pale. Her lips parted slightly as she turned to me, eyes wide, her previous arrogance crumbling in real time. She had spent the last 15 minutes ridiculing me, reminding me of how she had moved up in life, mocking me for being a dropout. And now? Now she was staring at me like I was the only thing keeping this plane from falling out of the sky. I barely had time to register her stunned expression before the flight attendant rushed toward me. Jake, please, she breathed. It's bad. Passengers were watching. Everyone was watching. I exhaled slowly and stood. Susan grabbed my arm before I could move. Where are you going? She stammered. Her nails dug into my sleeve, her usual confidence replaced by something I'd never seen before. Actual fear. I met her gaze. To do what needs to be done, I said simply. Her grip loosened as I turned away. The flight attendant guided me toward the cockpit. Behind me, I could hear Susan's shaky voice. He's lying. He can't be serious. No one paid her any attention. Because right now, it wasn't about her. It wasn't about our past, her insults, or the years she spent convincing herself she had married a real man. Right now, only one thing mattered. And that was getting this plane safely to the ground. Inside the cockpit, the situation was even worse than I had imagined. The captain and the co-pilot were slumped in their seats, their faces glistening with sweat. A doctor, one of the passengers, was kneeling beside them, checking their vitals. They've been poisoned, he said grimly. Food poisoning. It hit fast. They're too weak to do anything. I frowned. Both of them? The doctor nodded. Yeah, it's bad. They're conscious, but just barely. The captain, his breathing shallow, turned his head slightly toward me. His eyes, though hazy, locked onto mine. You a pilot? He rasped. I gave a firm nod. His lips twitched in what might have been a weak attempt at relief. Good, he murmured. Plane's yours. That was all he could manage before slumping back against his seat, his strength completely drained. I didn't hesitate. I slid into the captain's seat, my hands moving instinctively across the controls. The weight of what I was about to do settled over me. Flying a plane wasn't the issue. I'd done it for years. But this? A mid-flight emergency. Hundreds of lives depending on me. And no backup. I let out a slow breath and adjusted my headset. "This is Jake, assuming command of the aircraft," I said into the radio. "Control, do you read me?" Static. Then, "Roger, Jake. We read you. What's your situation?" I gave a brief rundown. Incapacitated pilots, a doctor on board, and me, the only qualified person left to fly the plane. There was a pause before the voice on the other end spoke again, this time with a sharper, more serious tone. "Understood. We're diverting all resources to assist you in making a safe landing. Can you confirm your flight hours?" "Commercial pilot. Former Air Force," I replied. Another pause. Then, "Copy that, Jake. You're more than qualified." That was good news. Bad news? I had to do this alone. Back in the cabin, the passengers were fully aware that something was wrong. The whispers had turned into panicked conversations. People were looking toward the cockpit, toward the flight attendants, toward anything that might give them reassurance. And Susan? Susan was frozen in her seat. For the first time since she sat next to me, she wasn't speaking. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't sneering. She was staring at the cockpit door, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Excuse me, miss," the flight attendant beside her said. Susan flinched. What?" The flight attendant gave a tight-lipped smile, one designed to be reassuring but failing completely. "I need you to fasten your seatbelt and remain calm. We have a very experienced pilot handling the situation." Susan blinked rapidly. "Jake," she whispered. The flight attendant nodded. "Yes." Susan let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no amusement in it. She had spent years convincing herself that I was a failure, that I was beneath her, that leaving me was the best decision she had ever made. And yet, here we were. Her new life, her rich husband, her designer clothes, none of it mattered in this moment, because at 30,000 feet, money meant nothing, and I was the only thing standing between her and the ground. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's really going to land the plane?" The flight attendant nodded again. "Yes." Susan slowly turned her gaze back toward the cockpit door, and for the first time in her life, she looked small, powerless, like someone who just realized the universe had a sense of humor after all. In the cockpit, I tightened my grip on the controls as air traffic control fed me instructions. "Jake, you're approaching descent range. Are you comfortable with the landing sequence?" I glanced at the instruments. Landing a plane in an emergency wasn't hard. What made it difficult was everything else. The passengers, the pressure, the knowledge that one wrong move could be catastrophic. I pushed those thoughts aside. "Affirmative," I said. "I've got this." Another voice came through the radio, likely a supervisor stepping in. "Copy that, Jake. We're clearing the runway for you now. Just keep it steady." I nodded to myself. Steady. That's all I needed to be. Behind me, the doctor was still tending to the captain and co-pilot. The flight attendants were securing the cabin. And Susan? Susan was somewhere behind that door, finally realizing that fate had handed her a poetic slap in the face. I adjusted my grip and focused on the descent. I didn't know what would happen after we landed. I didn't know if Susan would try to talk to me, if she would apologize, or if she would pretend like this had never happened. But I did know one thing. By the time this flight was over, she would never call me Dropout Dude again. The cockpit door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the murmurs, the panic, and, most importantly, Susan. I didn't have time to process the absurdity of it all. Not now. I focused on the controls, the screens, the radio chatter. My fingers danced over the buttons instinctively, muscle memory kicking in. The weight of the situation settled on my shoulders, but it wasn't fear. Not yet. It was responsibility. I trained for this. I'd flown under pressure before. But this was different. Because now, it wasn't just a mission. It wasn't just an exercise. It was real. Hundreds of people sat behind me, their lives resting in my hands. People with families, people with dreams, people like Susan, who probably spent the entire flight convinced that money, status, and luxury hotels made her invincible. But not here. Not now. At 30,000 feet, nothing mattered except skill. And I was the only one on this plane who had it. I adjusted my headset. Control, this is Jake. I have command of the aircraft. The response was immediate. Copy that, Jake. We have you on radar. Are you comfortable with the plane model? I scanned the panel. Boeing 737. A commercial aircraft. Not quite the fighter jets I used to fly, but I had logged enough hours to know it well. Affirmative, I said. I'm good with the controls. Understood. We're here to guide you through the descent. Do you have co-pilot support? I glanced at the co-pilot's seat. The actual co-pilot was still conscious, but barely. His skin was clammy, his body slumped, his breaths shallow. Even if he wanted to help, he physically couldn't. No, I said. Flying solo. A brief silence. Then, Roger that. We're clearing emergency protocol for a solo landing. Solo landing. An entire plane. By myself. No pressure. I gripped the yoke, steadying my breath. I had this. I had to have this. Back in the cabin, the tension was suffocating. The passengers were starting to realize just how bad this was. One emergency announcement was alarming enough. But two? Now, whispers turned into frantic questions. Are we going to crash? Is there really no pilot? Did they just let some random guy into the cockpit? And Susan. Oh, Susan was spiraling. Her entire face had drained of color. She wasn't talking anymore. She wasn't even breathing properly. Because for all her talk about being above me, about leveling up, about how I was nothing, she had never needed me more than she did right now. It was poetic, really. The one person she had spent years trying to erase from her life was now the only person keeping her alive. I almost wished I could see her face at this moment. But then again, I already knew what it looked like. Absolute, undeniable fear. In the cockpit, air traffic control kept feeding me instructions. You're approaching descent range. Reduce altitude to 25,000 feet. I flicked the necessary switches, adjusting the throttle as I eased the aircraft into a slow descent. The turbulence kicked in slightly, just enough for passengers to feel the shift. I imagined the way they were gripping their armrests, their silent prayers, their hands tightening around their loved ones. I imagined Susan, sitting there, finally understanding that this wasn't some game. I wasn't some loser she could mock from the comfort of her luxury life. I was the one thing standing between her and disaster. I was the difference between life and death. And for the first time in years, she couldn't talk her way out of it. Control, we're at 25,000 feet, I confirmed. Copy that, Jake. You're doing great. Let's start prepping for final approach. Final approach. The real test. This was where things really mattered. The slightest miscalculation could send the plane spiraling. A wrong angle, an incorrect adjustment, a rushed maneuver. Any of it could turn this from a near miss to a tragedy. I took a steadying breath. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head. The past is the past. Focus on the moment. Right. The moment. I focused on the instruments, watching the numbers, feeling the plane's response, letting instinct guide me. This was what I was born for. Control. I'm beginning descent to 10,000 feet. Back in the cabin, Susan finally spoke. And it wasn't to mock me. It wasn't to throw another insult. It was a whisper. A terrified, fragile whisper. He's really flying the plane? The flight attendant beside her nodded. Yes. He's an experienced pilot. Susan swallowed. But I thought She couldn't even finish the sentence. Because deep down, she knew the truth. I wasn't the failure she had always convinced herself I was. I wasn't the dropout, the loser, the nobody. I was the reason she was still breathing. And there was nothing she could do to change that. Jake, you're at 10,000 feet, Control announced. Speed looks good. Wind resistance is light. You're on track. I tightened my grip on the controls. This was it. A few minutes from now, I would either be the guy who saved an entire plane, or the guy who didn't. No room for failure. No room for second-guessing. I was locked in. Control. Confirm landing strip status. Runway is clear, Jake. You're good to go. Deep breath. Here we go. I made the final adjustments, the runway coming into sight. Flaps down. Speed check. Landing gear engaged. The plane responded to every command. Control gave me clearance. And then, we touched down. Smooth. Steady. A perfect landing. The moment the wheels hit the ground, a ripple of relief spread through the passengers. Some cheered. Some cried. Some just sat there, completely overwhelmed. And Susan? She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just stared straight ahead, silent. For once in her life, she had nothing to say. I stepped out of the cockpit, catching my first glimpse of the cabin. All eyes turned to me. People who had no idea who I was just minutes ago now looked at me like I was a goddamn miracle. The flight attendants clapped. Some of the passengers applauded. And Susan? She just sat there. Her mouth opened slightly like she wanted to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, maybe some last-ditch attempt to salvage her pride. But she didn't. Because what could she possibly say? I had just done something her rich husband could never do. I had just saved her life. And now, I was walking away. The moment the wheels touched the ground, I felt the tension in my chest finally ease. I had done it. The plane was safe. The passengers were alive. But I wasn't celebrating, not yet. Even though my hands were steady on the controls, even though my breathing remained measured, the weight of what I had just done sat heavy on my shoulders. This wasn't just a routine flight. This wasn't just another landing. This was life or death, and I had been the one standing between the two. And yet, as I slowly taxied the plane to the designated area, my mind wasn't on myself. It wasn't even on the applause or the hushed whispers of relief from the cabin behind me. It was on one person, Susan. I hadn't seen her face yet, but I didn't need to. I knew what she looked like right now. The moment the reality sank in, that her ex-husband, the so-called dropout dude she had mocked relentlessly, had just saved her life. Her entire worldview must have shattered. And that was more satisfying than any applause could ever be. The moment the plane came to a full stop, the flight attendants wasted no time securing the situation. One of them, a woman in her early 40s, turned to me with wide eyes. "You just saved over 200 lives," she whispered, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe it. I gave a small nod. "That's the job." She let out a breathless laugh. "Not your job. Not today. You weren't even supposed to be here." That was true. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was just another passenger. Another nameless traveler on a flight to Hawaii. And yet, here I was. I looked at the two pilots, both still weak, both being helped by the onboard doctor. One of them gave me a small, exhausted thumbs up. I returned it before standing up. And that's when I turned to face the cabin. The moment I stepped through the cockpit door, I could feel the weight of their eyes. Every single passenger was staring at me, some in shock, some in awe, some with tears in their eyes. A few clapped, hesitant at first, then more confident. Then, more joined in. The applause grew, swelling through the cabin. I wasn't used to it. I wasn't the kind of guy who basked in attention. But right now, I let them have their moment. Because for them, I wasn't just a guy on a plane anymore. I was the man who had landed it. And then my eyes found her. Susan. She was sitting completely still, her seatbelt still fastened, her hands gripping the armrests as if she had forgotten how to move. Her face was pale, her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I walked past her without stopping, but as I did, I heard it. A whisper, barely a breath. "You're a pilot?" Not an insult, not a sneer, not dropout dude. Just a simple, disbelieving question. And I didn't bother answering, because the answer was right in front of her. I had just landed a damn plane. If she didn't get it now, she never would. The paramedics were waiting as we disembarked. The sick pilots were taken away first, then the more panicked passengers. I stood back, watching everything unfold, letting the adrenaline finally drain from my system. That's when I felt a presence next to me. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Susan. She stood there, close but not too close, shifting awkwardly on her heels. And then, she spoke. Jake. I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. She looked different. Not physically. She was still the same high-maintenance, designer-clad woman I remembered. But her attitude, that was different. Gone was the arrogance, the smugness, the superiority. What was left was something I had never seen in Susan before. Humility. Uncertainty. I didn't know, she murmured. I let out a short laugh. Yeah, no kidding. Her lips pressed together. I mean it. I shrugged. Doesn't really matter now, does it? She hesitated. It does. And then, she said something I never thought I'd hear from her. I'm sorry. I blinked. I actually blinked. Because Susan? Apologizing? That was about as rare as a solar eclipse. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. She swallowed hard. She stopped, exhaling sharply. For everything. For mocking me. For leaving me. For thinking I was a failure. She didn't say it outright, but I didn't need her to. I just looked at her for a long moment before shaking my head. We're not the same people anymore, Susan. Her eyes flickered. I know. Then, Jake, she hesitated, biting her lip. Can we? She didn't finish the sentence. Because she didn't have to. I already knew where she was going with it. Can we talk? Can we catch up? Can we fix this? I sighed, shoving my hands into my pockets. Susan. She perked up slightly. I'm not mad at you. She blinked. I don't hate you, I continued. I don't even care anymore. She flinched at that last part, but it was the truth. I had moved on. She was the one still stuck in the past. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. And for once in her life, Susan had nothing left to say. I turned away from her, walking toward the airport exit. I wasn't sure if she was still watching me, but as I stepped outside, taking in the fresh Hawaiian air, I knew one thing. She had spent years thinking she had one. That leaving me had been her best decision. That she had upgraded. But today, I was the one walking away. And this time, I wasn't looking back. Stepping out of the airport, I took a deep breath. The Hawaiian air was warm, salty, and refreshing. Completely different from the cold, stale air inside the plane. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It should have felt like the perfect beginning to my vacation, but my mind was still replaying everything that had happened. I had just landed a plane. I had just saved over 200 lives. And my ex-wife, the woman who had mocked me as a failure just hours ago, had been sitting in the seat next to me, watching it all unfold. The universe really had a twisted sense of humor. I let out a slow exhale, rolling my shoulders to shake off the tension. I needed to get to my friend's restaurant, grab a drink, and put this entire bizarre experience behind me. I had barely taken a few steps toward the taxi stand when I heard a voice behind me. A familiar, booming voice. Jake, that was you. I turned, and my stomach nearly dropped. Standing there, grinning like he'd just found a long-lost treasure, was a man in a crisp white dress shirt, tailored trousers, and expensive sunglasses perched on his head. He had the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in life, the kind of man who owned buildings rather than rented apartments. Mike, Susan's husband. Of course, because why wouldn't this day get even more ridiculous? I schooled my expression into something neutral as he strode up to me. Man, I thought that was you, he said, clapping a firm hand on my shoulder. I was in the airport lounge when I saw the news. Pilot collapses mid-flight. Passenger lands the plane. He shook his head in amazement. And then I saw your name. I had to come see you myself. I forced a small smile. Yeah, crazy day. Crazy? Mike let out a short laugh. Dude, that was insane. You saved everyone's lives. That's gotta feel incredible, right? I nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was heading. It's part of the job. Mike whistled. Man, that's humble as hell. If I did what you just did, I'd be telling every single person I met. He gestured toward the airport. People are still talking about it in there. You're a hero, Jake. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just nodded. And then, a small movement behind Mike caught my attention. Susan. She was standing several feet away, just watching. She wasn't approaching. She wasn't saying anything. She was just standing there, arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes darting between me and Mike. Mike followed my gaze, then grinned. "Oh yeah, you two know each other." I raised an eyebrow. "We do." Mike chuckled. "Come on, don't be modest. Susan told me you guys went to middle school together." I let that sit for a second. Middle school. That's the version of our history she had given him. Nothing about how we dated. Nothing about how we were married. Nothing about how she had left me, mocked me, and laughed at the idea of me ever being successful. Just middle school classmates. I glanced back at Susan. She knew I knew. And from the way she looked like she was holding her breath, I could tell she was waiting for something. Waiting for me to spill the truth. Waiting for me to ruin the perfect life she had built. Waiting for the one thing she feared the most, to be exposed. I turned back to Mike. Smiled. "Yeah," I said smoothly. "Middle school feels like a lifetime ago." Susan's shoulders sagged slightly in relief. She had no idea that my silence had nothing to do with her. It wasn't about protecting her. It was about something much simpler. I just didn't care anymore. Mike clapped his hands together. "Man, we've got to celebrate. My wife and I were actually about to head to dinner. Why don't you join us?" I almost laughed out loud. Sit at a table with Susan and pretend we barely knew each other? Not a chance. I shook my head. "I appreciate it, but I actually have plans. A friend of mine owns a restaurant here. I was just heading there." Mike's face lit up. "No way. Where at?" I gave him the name of the place. And that's when things took an even weirder turn. Mike grinned. "Oh, I know that place. I do business with the guy who owns it." Of course. Because of course he did. What were the odds that the man Susan left me for personally knew my friend? At this point, I wasn't even surprised anymore. Mike clapped my shoulder again. "You know what? Screw dinner at the hotel. Let's all go there instead. We'll celebrate properly." I bit the inside of my cheek. Declining the first invitation had been easy. But now I was stuck. Mike was clearly a good guy. Too good, actually. The kind of man who was so friendly, so eager to connect, that rejecting his invitation felt damn near impossible. And the last thing I wanted was for Susan to suspect that I was declining because of her. So I did the one thing I never thought I'd do. I nodded. "Sure." Susan tensed. Mike grinned. And just like that, dinner with my ex-wife and her husband was happening. The drive to the restaurant was excruciating. Susan and I sat in the back of Mike's luxury SUV while he drove, chatting about anything except us. She didn't speak. She didn't even look at me. She just kept her eyes on the road, hands clasped in her lap, her entire body stiff. She was nervous. I could feel it. And honestly, I was enjoying it a little too much. Because for the first time ever, Susan had no power here. She wasn't in control of the conversation. She wasn't dictating the narrative. She was trapped, just like I had been for years. And the best part? She had done it to herself. Mike pulled into the restaurant parking lot, then turned to us with a wide grin. "All right, let's eat." Susan swallowed hard. And me? I just smiled. Because for the first time ever, I wasn't the one on edge. Susan was. And she had no idea what was coming next. The restaurant was lively, filled with the hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and soft island music playing in the background. It was exactly the kind of place where I would have enjoyed unwinding after the insanity of the day. Except I wasn't here to unwind. I was here, somehow, sitting across from Susan and her husband, sipping on a whiskey that I desperately hoped would make this dinner tolerable. Mike, completely unaware of the unspoken tension at the table, was his usual charismatic self. "Man, Jake, you should have seen how people at the airport were talking about you. It was like watching a hero walk through the crowd." He shook his head, laughing. "You should have charged for autographs." I smirked, taking another sip of my drink. "I'll consider it as a side gig." Susan had barely spoken. She just sat there, picking at her food, not making eye contact with either of us. I could feel it, the weight of her anxiety, the fear that at any moment I would slip up and say something that shattered her carefully constructed life. I wasn't going to, but she didn't know that. And watching her squirm, that was better than any revenge I could have planned. "Mike, oblivious to everything, grinned. So, Jake, tell me, what's your story? I mean, you don't just wake up one day and decide to be a pilot, right? I set my drink down, giving him a small smile. No, I guess you don't. Susan tensed. Because she knew. She knew exactly where this conversation could go. I could talk about how I wasn't a dropout, how I had sacrificed everything for my career, how I had once been married to a woman who had mocked my ambitions, called me a failure, and left me because she thought she could do better. Instead, I leaned back and shrugged. I just always loved flying, I said simply, ever since I was a kid. Susan exhaled slowly, like she had just dodged a bullet. She wasn't wrong. Mike nodded, sipping his drink. That's incredible, man. Really? And what about family? Anyone special in your life? I didn't even glance at Susan. Nah, I said. Just me. Mike let out a laugh. Smart man. Marriage is great, but I tell you, keeping a woman happy? That's work. I finally looked at Susan. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. She was terrified. Not because of what I had said, but because of what I could say. I smirked. Yeah, I murmured. I bet it is. The conversation drifted toward other topics. Real estate, travel, investments. Susan barely spoke at all. She just sat there, shifting uncomfortably, forcing the occasional smile as Mike rambled on. It was fascinating, really. Watching her, I realized something. This wasn't the same Susan I had once known. The Susan I remembered was loud, confident, in control. This Susan? She was careful, timid, almost afraid. Of what? Of losing everything. Because she had built her entire life on a lie. And now? Now, she was sitting across from the one person who could expose it all. I wondered, was this how she felt when she left me? Powerful? Like she was holding all the cards? If so, I had to admit, it was a terrible feeling. Because the truth? She wasn't in control anymore. I was. And she knew it. Halfway through the meal, Mike excused himself to take a call. The second he was out of earshot, Susan finally spoke. What do you want? She whispered. I raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Her voice was low, urgent. Do you want money? Is that it? I actually laughed. Money? I repeated, amused. What makes you think I need anything from you? Susan swallowed hard. Because I know you, Jake. I know you. I tilted my head, studying her. No, I said slowly. I don't think you do. She let out a shaky breath. Then why? Why are you here? Why did you say yes to dinner? I leaned in slightly. Because Mike invited me. She flinched. And you know what's funny, Susan? I continued. I could have said no. I could have walked away. But you were so scared I would expose you that I figured. Why not sit back and enjoy the show? Her face paled. I shook my head. You think I care enough to ruin your life? Please. I chuckled, leaning back again. You're not that important to me. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew. She wasn't important to me anymore. And that scared her more than anything. Mike returned a few minutes later, clapping his hands together. Sorry about that. Business never stops, huh? Susan barely reacted. I gave him a nod. No worries. Mike glanced at his wife. You okay, babe? You look a little pale. Susan forced a smile. I'm fine. I smirked. No, she wasn't. And she never would be again. As dinner wrapped up, we stepped outside, the warm Hawaiian breeze carrying the scent of the ocean. Mike shook my hand firmly. Man, I'm glad we ran into each other. We should stay in touch. I nodded. Sure. I wasn't lying. I had no problem staying in touch. After all, it wasn't me who had something to hide. It was Susan. Mike turned to his wife. You ready to go? Susan nodded quickly. Too quickly. She didn't even look at me as they left. And as I watched them walk away, I realized something. She was trapped. Not by me. Not by Mike. By herself. Because even if I never said a word, she would always be terrified that one day I might. And that was the best revenge of all. I watched as Susan and Mike walked away, her stiff posture betraying her tension. She never turned back, never looked at me again. Not once. And that was enough. I didn't need to expose her. I didn't need to ruin her. She was already doing that to herself. Because now, she would spend every waking moment wondering if and when her past would catch up with her. And I was the only one who knew the full story. I turned away and started down the street toward my hotel, the sound of waves crashing in the distance. The Hawaiian night was warm, the sky clear, the stars brighter than I'd seen in a long time. And for the first time in years, I felt weightless. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying her anymore. I was free. The next morning, I woke up late, something I rarely did. But after the insanity of the last 24 hours, I figured I'd earned it. I stretched, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. No early flights to prepare for. No schedules to follow. No Susan breathing down my neck, trying to pick apart my life. I checked my phone. A couple of messages from my friend Bob, asking if I was still up for grabbing drinks that night. And one unexpected message from Mike. Hey man, great meeting you last night. If you're free, let's hit the golf course today. My treat. I stared at the screen for a moment. Mike wanted to hang out. With me. I could only imagine Susan's reaction when he told her that. I smirked, shaking my head. I wasn't about to spend my vacation playing golf with the guy who married my ex-wife, but it was fascinating to me how genuinely oblivious he was to everything. Part of me almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I sent back a polite decline, tossed my phone onto the nightstand, and got up. Today was going to be a good day. By noon, I was at the beach, lounging under an umbrella with a cold drink in hand. It was strange, being still. I was so used to moving. Piloting was all about momentum, precision, decision-making. I wasn't accustomed to just sitting somewhere and letting the world exist around me. And yet, I liked it. I liked the silence. I liked the peace. And more than anything, I liked knowing that no one controlled my life but me. Susan had spent years convincing herself that I was nothing without her. And yet, here I was, calm, content, successful, while she was the one suffocating under her own lies. I took a sip of my drink, letting the realization settle. This was what real winning felt like. Not revenge. Not proving a point. Just living well. And that was the one thing Susan would never be able to take from me. By late afternoon, I was walking through the streets of Honolulu, taking in the sights, when I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A jewelry store. A very expensive one. And standing in front of it, talking to an associate outside, was Susan. She was alone. No Mike. No entourage. Just her. I debated walking away. I had no interest in another interaction with her. But then, as if sensing my presence, she turned. And the second her eyes landed on me, I saw it. Panic. Not anger. Not arrogance. Not even annoyance. Just pure, unfiltered panic. For a moment, neither of us moved. And then, she did something I never expected. She walked up to me. Her eyes darted around, making sure no one was listening. "What are you doing here?" she hissed under her breath. I raised an eyebrow. "I'm on vacation. In Hawaii. You know, the place you mocked me for affording?" Her jaw clenched. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." I smirked. "Then maybe you should ask better questions." She exhaled sharply. "Jake, listen. She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "You're not going to tell Mike, are you?" I tilted my head. "Tell him what, exactly?" Susan swallowed hard. I let the silence stretch, because I wanted to see how much of her pride she was willing to swallow. "About us," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the past." I watched her carefully. She looked tired. Not just physically, but mentally. She had spent years crafting her perfect life, and now, she realized how fragile it actually was. How one conversation, one truth, could bring it all crumbling down. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of losing Mike. She was afraid of losing what Mike gave her. The money, the status, the life she had convinced herself she deserved. And that was pathetic. I sighed, shaking my head. "Susan, I don't care." She blinked. What? I crossed my arms. "I don't care enough to say anything. I don't care enough to get involved. And honestly, I don't care about you." Her mouth opened slightly, as if she was about to argue. Then she shut it again. Because she knew. For the first time, she knew. She had spent so much time trying to tear me down, only to realize that she was the one who had built her life on shaky ground. She was the one trapped. She was the one who would never be free. Because even if I never said a word, she would always be looking over her shoulder. She would always be wondering. She would always be waiting for the truth to catch up to her. And that was better than any revenge I could have planned. I stepped back, giving her one last look. Enjoy your life, Susan. Then, without another word, I walked away. And this time, I didn't look back.